Montana, July 1988. A vast state where highways stretched for miles through empty plains and mountain ranges, where small towns existed hours apart, and where travelers relied on scattered gas stations that served as lifelines between destinations, places where strangers stopped briefly before disappearing back into the wilderness. Nora Ellwood was 32 years old, a single mother driving from Seattle to Minneapolis with her 5-year-old daughter Nora, relocating after a difficult divorce, and they had been on the road for 2 days, sleeping in cheap motels, and the drive through Montana seemed endless with nothing but sagebrush and distant peaks. Nora had bright copper-red hair that caught sunlight like fire, pale skin covered in freckles, blue eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and a personality that was the opposite of shy. She talked constantly, asked endless questions, made friends with everyone she met, and had boundless energy that made long car rides difficult. They were driving east on Highway 2 toward Glacier National Park, and around 2 in the afternoon, Linda saw a gas station ahead, a small building with 2 pumps sitting alone against the vast Montana landscape, and the fuel gauge was near empty, and this was the only station for 60 miles. She pulled up to the pump, and the station was called Mountain View Gas and General Store, and it looked weathered and old, and a hand-painted sign advertised cold drinks and homemade sandwiches, and a yellow dog was lying in the shade near the entrance. Nora immediately noticed the dog and begged to pet it, and Linda said she could while Linda pumped gas, and Nora jumped out of the car wearing her pink winter jacket because the air was cool despite being July, and she ran to the dog calling, "Puppy, puppy, puppy," in her high, excited voice. The dog was friendly, a golden retriever mix, and it stood up wagging its tail, and Nora knelt beside it petting and talking to it, and Linda watched from the pump smiling at her daughter's joy, and everything felt safe and ordinary and like a pleasant break from hours of driving. Linda finished pumping $23 of gas, and she walked toward the station entrance to pay, and she glanced at Nora, who was still with the dog about 30 feet away, and Linda called, "Stay right there where I can see you," and Nora waved without looking up. The inside of the station was dim and smelled like coffee and motor oil, and a woman was behind the counter. She was in her 40s with graying brown hair and a tired expression, and her name tag said, Ruth, and Linda said she needed to pay for pump 2. Ruth processed the payment slowly, making small talk about the weather and the drive, and Linda glanced through the window checking on Nora, and she could see the pink jacket and the yellow dog, and everything looked fine, and she turned back to sign the credit card receipt. The transaction took maybe 3 minutes, and when Linda walked back outside carrying a bag with sodas and chips she had bought, the yellow dog was still there lying in the shade, but Nora was gone, and Linda's stomach dropped. She called Nora's name thinking she had wandered to the side of the building or to the car, but there was no answer, and Linda walked quickly around the small station building checking behind it, beside the storage shed, near the dumpster, but Nora was not there. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel, and if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA Archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. Linda ran back inside and asked Ruth if she had seen Nora, and Ruth said no. She had been at the register the whole time, and Linda's voice grew panicked, saying her daughter had been right outside with the dog, and now she was gone. Ruth came outside and helped search, and they called Nora's name, and Ruth asked if Nora might have gotten into the car, but Linda checked and the car doors were locked, and Nora could not have gotten in without Linda seeing or hearing. Linda noticed that Ruth's pickup truck was parked behind the building, and she asked if Ruth had left the register at any point, and Ruth said no. She had been there continuously, but Linda felt something was wrong, felt Ruth's demeanor was too calm. A man emerged from the storage shed behind the station. He was in his 50s, wearing coveralls, and Ruth introduced him as her husband Vincent, who did maintenance, and he said he had been organizing inventory and had not seen or heard anything. Linda demanded they call the police, and Ruth went inside to use the phone, and Linda stood in the empty parking lot calling Nora's name, her voice echoing across the plains, and she realized how isolated this place was, how a child could disappear, and no one would see. Montana Highway Patrol arrived 40 minutes later. The nearest officer had been stationed 60 miles away, and Trooper Daniel Hayes took the report, and he was 51 years old with 30 years of experience. and he immediately understood the situation was critical. Hayes interviewed Linda, asking exactly when she last saw Nora, what she was wearing, if Nora would go with strangers, and Linda described the pink jacket, the red hair, and said Nora was friendly and trusting, and would talk to anyone, and Hayes's expression grew grim. He interviewed Ruth and Vincent McCormick, asking if they had seen vehicles come or go, if they had noticed anyone else at the station, but both said no. It had been quiet all afternoon. Linda and Nora were the only customers they remembered. Hayes searched the area around the station, and he found small footprints in the dirt near where Nora had been playing with the dog, and the prints led toward the back of the building, but then disappeared at the gravel parking area where tire tracks were too mixed to distinguish. Search and rescue teams arrived by evening with dogs and volunteers from nearby towns, and they combed through the surrounding wilderness, checking ravines and creek beds, looking for any sign of a small girl in a pink jacket. But the landscape was vast, and Nora was tiny, and finding her seemed impossible. Trooper Hayes focused on the timeline. Linda had been inside the station for approximately 3 minutes, and during those 3 minutes Nora had vanished, and the only people at the station were Ruth and Vincent McCormick, and Hayes began to suspect they were not telling the truth. He interviewed them separately, asking Ruth to describe exactly what she had been doing when Linda was inside paying, and Ruth said she had been at the register processing the transaction. She had not left her post, had not looked outside, had just focused on the customer. Vincent said he had been in the storage shed organizing supplies. He had heard a car pull up but had not come out because Ruth handled customers, and he had not seen or heard Nora at all, had not known a child was at the station until Linda started panicking. Hayes asked if anyone else had been at the station that afternoon, any customers or delivery drivers, but Ruth checked her log and said Linda was the only customer between noon and 3 o'clock, and no deliveries were scheduled, and they had been alone at the remote station. He obtained permission to search the McCormick's property, and they consented immediately, and officers searched the station, the storage shed, the small house where Ruth and Vincent lived behind the station, and they found nothing suggesting a child had been there. Their pickup truck was searched thoroughly, and no evidence of Nora was found. No red hair, no fibers from her pink jacket, nothing to connect them to her disappearance, and Hayes was frustrated because his instinct said something was wrong, but he had no proof. Ruth and Vincent both took polygraph tests 2 days later, and Ruth's results were inconclusive, showing stress that could be explained by the accusatory nature of the investigation, and Vincent passed completely, and without evidence Hayes could not charge them with anything. The case dominated Montana news, with Nora's kindergarten photo, showing her bright red hair and big smile appearing on television, and the story of a child vanishing from a gas station in seconds shocked the state where people assumed rural areas were safe. Linda appeared on television holding Nora's stuffed rabbit that had been in the car, begging for her daughter's return, describing Nora's talkative personality and her love of animals, and she pleaded with whoever had taken her to bring her home. Weeks turned into months with massive searches of wilderness areas around Highway 2, with helicopters searching from the air, with volunteers checking abandoned buildings and mines, but no trace of Nora was found. Not her pink jacket, not a shoe, nothing. The investigation expanded to check known sex offenders within 200 miles, and Hayes interviewed dozens of individuals, but all had alibis or were quickly cleared, and none had been near the Mountain View gas station on July 19, 1988. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them, so if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. The case went cold by the end of 1988, with the McCormicks remaining the only people of interest, but with no evidence to pursue charges, and Linda was left with the terrible suspicion that the couple who had seemed helpful had actually taken her daughter. Linda never finished the drive to Minneapolis. She stayed in Montana hoping Nora would be found, and she eventually settled in Kalispell, about 80 miles from where Nora disappeared, and she worked as a waitress and volunteered with missing children organizations. She could never bring herself to go back to that gas station, could never drive past it on Highway 2, and she took long detours to avoid the location where she had lost everything, and she kept Nora's pink jacket that had been found in the car, the only thing she had left. Years passed, and Nora's case became one of Montana's most mysterious unsolved child disappearances, and her face appeared on age progression posters, showing what she might look like at 10, at 20, at 30, but no credible sightings ever materialized. Trooper Hayes retired in 2007 after 47 years in law enforcement, and Nora's case remained unsolved. The little girl who vanished from a gas station in 3 minutes, and he died in 2015 still believing the McCormicks knew what had happened. Ruth and Vincent McCormick continued operating Mountain View Gas until they retired in 2012 and moved to Alaska, and they had maintained their innocence for decades, and without new evidence the case remained cold and frustrating. In May 2024, 36 years after Nora disappeared, the Montana Department of Justice received an anonymous phone call from someone in Alaska who said they knew where Nora Ellwood was, that she was alive and living in a remote village, and she had been there since 1988. The call was transferred to Detective Maria Reeves, who now handled cold missing persons cases, and she listened as the caller, a woman who would not give her name, explained that Nora had been taken by Ruth and Vincent McCormick and raised in isolation as their daughter. The caller said she was a healthcare worker who had recently visited the remote community of Haines, Alaska, and had met a woman named Sarah McCormick who had red hair and talked about growing up without electricity or contact with the outside world, and something about her story seemed wrong. The caller had researched missing children cases from the 1980s and had found Nora Ellwood's photo, and the resemblance to Sarah McCormick was striking, the same red hair, the same facial structure, and the caller believed Sarah was actually Nora and did not know her real identity. Detective Reeves contacted Alaska State Troopers and requested they investigate Sarah McCormick in Haines, and she provided Nora's description and the information about Ruth and Vincent McCormick having moved to Alaska in 2012, and troopers agreed to make contact. Alaska State Trooper Jennifer Walsh traveled to Haines, a small isolated community accessible primarily by ferry, and she located the McCormick residence, a cabin on the outskirts where Ruth and Vincent lived, with a woman they introduced as their daughter Sarah. Walsh observed that Sarah was approximately 41 years old with distinctive copper-red hair and freckles, and she fit the general description of what Nora Ellwood might look like as an adult, and Walsh requested to speak with Sarah privately, and Ruth and Vincent reluctantly agreed. Sarah seemed confused by the trooper's visit, and Walsh asked her about her childhood, where she was born, what she remembered from being young, and Sarah said she was born in Montana. Her parents had homeschooled her on their property, and they had moved to Alaska when she was 28. Walsh asked if Sarah had a birth certificate, and Sarah said she did, and she showed Walsh a document indicating she was born Sarah Elizabeth McCormick in 1983 at home in Montana. But Walsh noticed the document looked unofficial, possibly forged. She asked Sarah if she had ever been to a doctor or dentist, and Sarah said rarely. Her parents believed in natural medicine and had kept her isolated, and she had never attended school, never had friends outside the family, and had lived her entire life with Ruth and Vincent. Walsh asked if Sarah had memories from before age 5, and Sarah paused and said she had fragments, remembered a long car ride, remembered someone singing to her, remembered a woman who was not Ruth, but Ruth had always told her those were dreams or confusion from being very young. Walsh explained that there was a missing child case from 1988 involving a girl named Nora Ellwood who looked remarkably similar to Sarah, and Sarah's face went pale, and she asked what Walsh was suggesting, and Walsh said DNA testing could determine if Sarah was actually Nora. Sarah agreed immediately. She said she had always felt something was wrong, that her life had been strange and isolated, that Ruth and Vincent's explanations never quite made sense, and she wanted to know the truth, and Walsh collected a DNA sample. The DNA results were sent to the Montana State Crime Lab, with a request for expedited processing and comparison to Linda Ellwood's DNA, which was on file from the original investigation, and Reeves waited anxiously for results that would take 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Walsh interviewed Ruth and Vincent McCormick separately at the Alaska State Trooper post in Haines, and their stories began to unravel under questioning, and Ruth eventually broke down crying and said she wanted to confess that she had carried guilt for 36 years. Ruth said she and Vincent had been unable to have children, had tried fertility treatments that failed, and had become desperate and obsessed with having a daughter. And when Linda Ellwood and Nora stopped at their gas station in July 1988, Ruth saw an opportunity. She said Linda had come inside to pay, and Ruth had watched through the window as Nora played with the dog, and she had called to Vincent through the back door, and Vincent had come out and quickly grabbed Nora, while Ruth kept Linda distracted by processing the payments slowly. Vincent had carried Nora to their pickup truck parked behind the building, had put her in the covered truck bed, and had driven away immediately on a back road, and by the time Linda came outside looking for Nora, Vincent and Nora were already miles away heading north. Ruth said Vincent had driven to a remote property they owned in northern Montana near the Canadian border, and they had kept Nora there for 3 months, changing her appearance by cutting her distinctive red hair short and dyeing it brown. And they had told her that her mother had abandoned her and they were her new family. They had moved to the remote property permanently, living off-grid with no electricity or contact with the outside world, homeschooling Nora, who they renamed Sarah, and they had isolated her completely. And over years, Nora's memories of her previous life had faded, replaced by the reality Ruth and Vincent created. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. In 2012, when they moved to Alaska, they had used forged documents showing Sarah was their biological daughter born at home, and no one in Haines had questioned it, and they had continued the deception for 12 more years, and Ruth said the guilt had destroyed her, but she had been too afraid to confess. Vincent corroborated Ruth's confession, and he said they had never physically harmed Nora, had raised her with care, but he acknowledged they had stolen her childhood and her identity, and he expressed remorse, but also said he had loved her as his daughter. The DNA results came back confirming that Sarah McCormick was definitively Nora Ellwood, and Reeves called Linda, who is now 68 and still living in Kalispell, and she told her that Nora had been found alive in Alaska, and Linda screamed and collapsed. 36 years of not knowing replaced by miracle and horror combined. Linda flew to Alaska immediately, accompanied by Detective Reeves, and the reunion was arranged carefully at the Alaska State Trooper post in Juneau with counselors present. And when Linda saw Nora for the first time in 36 years, she saw her 5-year-old daughter in the face of a 41-year-old woman with red hair. They embraced and both cried, but the moment felt strange and disconnected. Linda was hugging a stranger who happened to be her daughter, and Nora did not recognize Linda at all, had no memories of her, had lived her entire conscious life believing Ruth and Vincent were her parents. Nora struggled to process the revelation. Her entire identity had been a lie. The parents she had known for 36 years had kidnapped her, and this woman claiming to be her mother was a complete stranger, and she felt unmoored from reality, not knowing who she really was. Linda tried to explain what Nora had been like as a child, showed her photographs from before the abduction, told her about the drive from Seattle to Minneapolis that had been interrupted at that Montana gas station, but Nora could not connect these stories to her own memories. The fragments Nora remembered, the car ride and the singing woman, had been dismissed by Ruth as dreams, but now they took on new meaning. They were real memories of Linda, of the life stolen from her, and Nora grieved for the childhood she could not remember. Ruth and Vincent McCormick were arrested and charged with kidnapping, child abduction across state lines, forging documents, and conspiracy, and they were extradited to Montana to face trial, and they both pleaded guilty, accepting responsibility for what they had done. At their sentencing hearing in November 2024, Linda gave a victim impact statement describing the 36 years of torture, the not knowing, the suspicion that had pointed to the McCormicks but without proof, and the rage that they had operated their gas station for decades while hiding her daughter. She said they had not just stolen Nora, they had stolen Linda's entire adult life. Every birthday and holiday and milestone had been marked by absence and grief, and her fury was so intense that security had to ensure she did not approach them in the courtroom. Nora also gave a statement, and she spoke about the confusion of learning her life was a lie, about loving Ruth and Vincent despite understanding what they had done, and about the psychological damage of having her identity erased and replaced, and she said no sentence could repair the harm. The judge sentenced Ruth to 25 years in prison and Vincent to 30 years, and they were led away in handcuffs, and Nora watched them go with conflicting emotions, grief for the parents she had known mixed with anger at the criminals they actually were. The case attracted massive national attention, and journalists wanted interviews about the gas station attendants who had stolen a child in plain sight and hidden her for 36 years. But Linda and Nora declined most requests, needing privacy to process everything. Nora returned to Montana with Linda, and they lived together in Kalispell while Nora tried to understand the world she had been isolated from. And at 41, she was learning things most people learned as children: how to use technology, how to navigate social situations, how to function in modern society. She had never had a job outside the family, had never had friends, had never been to a movie theater or a restaurant, and the world was overwhelming and frightening. And she relied heavily on Linda, who was a stranger, but also her only biological family. Linda tried to be patient, but the gap between them was enormous, and she wanted her talkative 5-year-old daughter back, while Nora was a quiet, 41-year-old woman who had been taught to be suspicious of outsiders, and bridging that gap required constant effort. Nora struggled with what to call herself. She had been Sarah for 36 years. That was the name she responded to, the name that felt like hers, and being called Nora felt foreign and uncomfortable, and she eventually decided to use both. Nora Sarah Ellwood McCormick, acknowledging both identities. She also struggled with her feelings about Ruth and Vincent. 36 years of love and care could not be erased by learning the truth, and she grieved for them, even while understanding they had destroyed her life. And her therapist said both feelings could coexist. Love and betrayal were not mutually exclusive. Linda established a foundation in 2025 called the Nora Ellwood Recovery Initiative, dedicated to supporting adults who had been abducted as children and raised by their captors, recognizing that their trauma was unique and required specialized psychological support and reintegration services. The foundation also advocated for better security at remote gas stations and rest stops, for cameras and monitoring systems that could prevent abductions from isolated locations, and for training employees to recognize suspicious behavior and protect vulnerable travelers. Nora began working with the foundation despite her discomfort with attention, and she spoke at conferences about the experience of living decades with a false identity, about the psychological impact of isolation and indoctrination, and about the possibility of rebuilding life even after such extreme circumstances. She emphasized that Ruth and Vincent had been mentally ill in their desperation for a child, that their obsession had driven them to a terrible crime, but that mental illness did not excuse kidnapping, and she hoped her story would encourage better mental health support for people struggling with infertility. The pink jacket that Nora had been wearing when she was taken had been kept by Linda for 36 years, and it was submitted for DNA testing, and the lab found Nora's childhood DNA along with Vincent's DNA on the sleeves where he had grabbed her, confirming the abduction narrative. The months following the sentencing were filled with painful adjustments, as Nora tried to build a relationship with Linda while grieving the loss of Ruth and Vincent, who despite everything had been the only parents she had known for nearly 4 decades. She enrolled in therapy 3 times weekly, working through complex trauma, and her therapist explained she was experiencing a unique form of grief, mourning her stolen childhood while also mourning the false family that had raised her, and processing both simultaneously was overwhelming. Linda struggled with her own complicated emotions. Joy that Nora was alive mixed with rage at the McCormicks and grief for the 36 years stolen from both of them. Years that could never be recovered, milestones she had missed, and a mother-daughter bond that felt impossible to build from scratch. She tried to share memories of Nora's early childhood, the first 5 years before the abduction, telling her about learning to walk, first words, favorite toys. But Nora had no connection to these stories. They felt like tales about a different person, and Linda realized her 5-year-old daughter was gone forever. Nora began taking small steps toward independence. She got her first driver's license at 41, opened a bank account in her real name, took adult education classes to get a high school equivalency diploma, and found work at a library shelving books, a quiet job that did not overwhelm her. She also began cautiously building friendships with coworkers and therapy group members, her first real relationships outside of Ruth and Vincent, and learning to trust people was difficult after decades of isolation. But she persisted, determined to experience life she had been denied. The anonymous caller who had reported Sarah McCormick's existence was eventually identified as a nurse practitioner named Angela Torres, who had been visiting Haynes as part of a rural healthcare program, and Linda thanked her tearfully for caring enough to investigate and make the call that brought Nora home. Torres said she had almost dismissed her suspicions because Sarah seemed happy, and the McCormicks seemed kind, but something had nagged at her, and she was grateful she had trusted her instincts, and she encouraged others to report suspicions, even when they seemed unlikely. The documentary about Nora's case was released in 2026 titled 3 Minutes: The Nora Ellwood Story, and it detailed the abduction from the gas station, the 36 years in isolation, and the anonymous tip that solved the case. The documentary sparked conversations about how abductions happen in seconds at isolated locations, about how perpetrators can hide in plain sight for decades, about the importance of trusting instincts and reporting suspicions, and about the lifelong impact on victims who are raised by their abductors. Linda's health began to decline in 2027 with lung cancer, and knowing her time was limited, she tried to spend as much time as possible with Nora, and they took road trips through Montana, and Linda showed her places from before the abduction, trying to rebuild connections. They drove past the Mountain View gas station, which had closed in 2012, and now sat abandoned on Highway 2, windows broken and pumps rusted, and Nora stared at it trying to remember being there at 5 but could not, the memory erased by time and trauma. Linda died peacefully in hospice care in May 2028 at age 72, and Nora was devastated. She had just found her mother after 36 years and lost her after only 4, and she spoke at the funeral about Linda's strength, her decades of searching, and her grace in accepting a damaged relationship. She was buried at Conrad Memorial Cemetery in Kalispell, and Nora visited the grave weekly, bringing flowers and talking to the mother she barely remembered, about learning to live as Nora instead of Sarah, about forgiving Ruth and Vincent while understanding their crime, about building a life from fragments. Nora continued therapy into her 40s, working through layers of identity confusion and grief, and her therapist said healing from 36 years of stolen identity would take a lifetime, that she would always carry both Sarah and Nora within her, and integration was possible even if wholeness was not. She also began writing a memoir about her experience, documenting the fragments she remembered, the isolated life in Montana and Alaska, the moment of discovering the truth, and the journey of reclaiming her identity, and she hoped her story would help other victims of long-term abduction. The memoir was published in 2029 titled The Girl from the Gas Station: Reclaiming Nora, and it became a bestseller, and Nora donated all proceeds to the foundation in her mother's name, ensuring her story would fund help for others. Ruth McCormick died in prison in 2030 from a stroke at age 86. And she had written letters to Nora apologizing and trying to explain her obsession, but Nora never opened them. She was not ready to engage with Ruth's justifications, and she kept the letters sealed in a box. Vincent remained in prison serving his sentence, and he was now 92, and he had requested to see Nora, but she declined. She had said goodbye to him in the courtroom and did not want to reopen that relationship, and she focused on moving forward rather than looking back. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. And it reminds us that abductions happen in seconds at isolated locations, that perpetrators hide stolen children in plain sight, and that anonymous tips can save lives even decades later. Nora Ellwood was 5 years old when she vanished from a Montana gas station in 3 minutes, while her mother paid for fuel, taken by desperate gas station attendants who had watched her play with their dog and seized the opportunity to steal the child they could not have. Not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to survival and the complexity of stolen identity, as proof that victims can be hidden for decades in isolated communities, as validation that suspicious observations deserve investigation even years later, and as inspiration for never giving up on missing persons. Her pink jacket preserved the DNA that confirmed Vincent had grabbed her, and that jacket waited 36 years in Linda's closet, and in the end, the truth emerged, not through investigation, but through one healthcare worker who noticed something wrong and cared enough to report it, proving that justice sometimes depends on strangers trusting their instincts, and that some people spend lifetimes learning who they really are after having their identities stolen as children. And healing is possible, though the scars remain forever, and love can exist alongside betrayal in ways that never fully resolve.